So you don't have to pay attention now. You can come back and watch it later or read about it later. But anyway, so the first things first, logistically, so this is going to be, I think the presentation is about 30 or 35 slides. Shouldn't take more than half hour, but we're going to make it interactive. There's going to be polls inside. There's going to be questions that we'll throw out, and we're going to pause for questions at multiple spaces. But first and foremost, let's introduce ourselves. So as you can see, this is me. So let me do this. I use the laser pointer here. So that's me. I used to be at McMaster. I was the director of what used to be the Computing Infrastructure Research Center, or CIRC. And my colleagues, Gada and Shovik, who were also at CIRC or CERT, we were all part of McMaster Engineering at one point, and then we spun out recently. And Erica, who's also on this presentation and would do a part of the presentation with me, she joined our team later. She was the first non-engineering hire for our company, and she leads our marketing and lead generation efforts. So she's going to talk a little bit about that. With that being said, let's first focus on, like, we're talking about product development, how to turn your idea into a product today. So let's start with definitions. I love doing things this way. What is a product? Now, I would encourage you to focus on like the #1 definition here, because the #2 doesn't really apply to us. And product is an article or substance that's manufactured or refined for sale. So the most important thing about a product is you need to be able to sell in some way, shape, or form. And I put it out there like 6 times. I actually had an animation for that too, and somehow there we go. So you have to be able to sell your product. And there's things that you do, like a lot of us, especially when we're students, we have like really cool ideas, but about like making a fancy robot or a machine that solves a lot of problems. But often because we're like, I've been through this myself. In one of my projects, I made a robot that was for firefighters to climb stairs. Well, it was supposed to be a robot that replaces firefighters and could climb stairs. I had no idea how to make it or set, like I made a prototype of it as a school project, but I had no idea how to make like tons of it, or I had no idea how to sell them. Taught myself the hard way. But to sell, the most fundamental thing that you need is a customer, which is a person or an organization that buys goods, which basically means they're going to pay for it. So with that, let's do our first poll of the day. If you're thinking of developing a product, where are you in identifying your customers? The reason we do these polls is first off so you get to know who else is on this presentation with you, but also so that we can tune the rest of the presentation for you. So with that, Erica, would you mind sharing your screen? And so for this, what you do is you go to kahoot.it. I'll put the link in the chat. And so in there, put in the pin when you go to kahoot.it, and it will give you the 4 choices. Camel is the only participant so far. Anthony. Wonder who Marky Mark is. People keep dropping out. I wonder if there's something wrong with it. Yeah, we have 7 participants in this. Anybody else who want to join? Closing in 3, 2, 1. Let's start. So on your phone or whatever device you're using, you would see these 4 options. Pick one. Ten seconds. All right, so looks like everybody has, like there's no correct answers to this one, but you know, the fact that all of you are aware that you have to identify a customer, it's really, really good. That's 86%. So that's a big part of our presentation today, how to find that customer. And then we'll talk about a few other logistical things. And like once you find your customer, then what? How do you build a product, etc. But let's go back to the presentation. So this was the poll for the people who joined a little bit later. Just wanted to remind you, we're going to do a few polls throughout the presentation today. This was number 1. With that, let's start talking about what are we gonna what's our agenda for the day. So next, we're gonna talk about customer discovery. So all of you know, like majority of you know that you have to find a customer and you have to, by identifying their problems really well. We're gonna figure out how to do that. There's like systematic methods for doing that. That's called customer discovery. Then we're gonna spend a couple minutes talking about product development best practices. Then you know, we're going to delve a little bit into marketing and sales, which being engineers, a lot of you probably don't have a background on. And then you know, some of the other stuff that comes at the end is like how to build a great team for a startup or a company that you're going to start. And we'll finish with talking a little bit about us, how we like FYELABS as a company, how we started as a part of McMaster Engineering, how we spun out, and where we are today. All right. Any questions so far, anybody?
Just have a logistical comment. You can keep your kahoot.it open, as we'll use the same game for all the polls in the presentation. But I can restart it if you do choose to join and you didn't join for the first one. So just so you know.
All righty. So next up, customer discovery. So we'll start with something called the business model canvas. So Shahram is having trouble with the poll, I believe. So Shahram, I think you will be able to, next time we do a poll, you'll be able to log in. It generates a pin that everybody has to sign in with. Okay, so customer discovery, we're going to talk about 2 things, the business model canvas and hypothesis testing. So quick show of hands, how many of you have seen the business model canvas before? I guess nobody. Perfect, then I have lots to talk about. So a business model canvas is like a very somewhat oversimplified way of you know, starting to think about a business built around your product. And what often gets missed is there's this definite sequence of ways so you fill up these things. So you start with the value prop here, Then you go to customer segments, then channels, partners, like there's a lot of other things that fall in place. But the most foundational aspect of it is figuring out what your value proposition is and who your customers are. So let's talk about that. What is value proposition? As you see, it says over here, identifying really, really well which problem are you solving for the customer. What is their pain point? What are the key features that you need to solve their pain point, etc. And once you know that well, you can then figure out who the customer is, and vice versa. So if you can do a good mapping between the value propositions and the customer segments, in my experience of having built about 75 or so products so far, your product's going to be relatively successful. You're starting off on a very good foundation. Whereas if you instead, there's a lot of times that we try to do it the other way. We figure out what the value proposition is and try to build a business around without validating it with the customer. And that's when I've seen a lot of startups fail, including the first couple of startups that I started in my life. So how do you figure out what your value proposition, is your value proposition valid? Is your customer segment valid? The thing is, anything that you put on the business model canvas is a hypothesis. So let's say let's say you're selling something like a toothbrush. Your value proposition is clean teeth, but that's a hypothesis. You're assuming that people want clean teeth. You have to validate that. I know this sounds very obvious, but this is for more other products. This is a little bit more complex. What you do is in the business model canvas, you put them down as a hypothesis, and then you validate that. And the way you validate that is by designing experiments. So let's take an example of an experiment. Take an example of say I have value proposition that hydrogen consumers have difficulty in storing hydrogen inventory and want just-in-time delivery, just like a hydrogen utility. I don't know if all of you are in engineering, so you probably know hydrogen is one of the more promising fuels for society right now, but storing hydrogen is often a problem. If I were to test this hypothesis, what I would do is create a hypothesis statement that procurement at the following have difficulty storing hydrogen. For instance, like a fleet operator that uses hydrogen for vehicle fuel, an industrial consumer such as a semiconductor manufacturing facility that uses hydrogen for specific types of reactions, I believe. Behind meter power refers to situations where you use hydrogen fuel cells to generate power in a facility behind the meter, so you're no longer drawing power from the utility. Now, these are hypotheses regarding my customer segment, but what I've done is I've created a value proposition that I'm going to now validate. One of the most conventional ways of doing that is you interview individuals in these 3 customer segments linked to this value proposition that I list over here, and you go the best way to do it is you go interview them, ask them what it is that they do right now, without ever referring to any technology that you're trying to sell. Because the moment you refer to a technology, you kind of bias them. So if you, in this particular situation, what I did was I made an assumption that procurement personnel at the customer segment organizations would validate difficulty in storing hydrogen inventory. So if you go talk to these people, ask them what their main problems are today, if they mention that storing hydrogen is a big headache for them, that means your thing is validated. So in this particular instance, I saw 34 thumbs ups, or 34 people validated, 4 people were like meh, and 1 individual said that's not a problem at all. And I usually a criteria, like if more than 80% validate a particular hypothesis, that's considered to be a really good validation. Now, I'm trying to do this really, really quickly on the whole concept of hypothesis testing, but there is some material here. So these are the 2 books that you could probably pick up even online and read about what the business model canvas is, what is the hypothesis testing model, and things like that. So like these are the books I learned from when I was a student myself. I had the good fortune of learning it from a program by Steve Blank, who was the author of one of these books. But you know, we're around to help you guys if you ever need any support from us at FYELABS. So with that, let's pause for a second. Any questions on the business model canvas, value propositions, hypothesis testing, etc.? I guess not. I guess everybody understood everything I said. Even Mark doesn't have a question. Mark always has questions. All right, that brings us to our poll number 2, which is how are you building your product? You know, this presentation is about how to turn an idea into a product. So how are you building your product, or how are you planning to build your product? Are you well, these are the 4 options. Are you trying to make it really, really cutting edge? Are you trying to make it far better than the competition? Are you making it just enough to sell? And are you making it really, really pretty? So with that, Erica, if you don't mind, would you start the poll and maybe even share the music?
So there's the game pin again, if anybody would like to rejoin.
"17 people signed in. Oh. Someone had a question. If you go to kahoot.it and it will ask you for a game pin. If you want to insert that, it would log you in. I don't know how to drop anybody. Can you know?
Sorry, say that again.
So Sharam is saying that he can't join because there is he closed the tab and something.
Can you try using a different username, perhaps? Logging into the same game pin. There we go.
Okay, now there's three of you, Sharam. So you get a lot of weight on this poll. All right, should we start?
Yeah. So I'm just going to skip the first question and we'll move on to our next poll. So just give me one moment. Okay.
Okay, the 4 options right in front of you. All righty. So we have, I guess, very close competition between number 4, number 2, 3, and 4. And that's very interesting to see. So like as we go through the rest of the presentation, we'd talk a little bit about what are some of the best practices. But as I said before, there's no right answer to any of these things. You have to figure out what's going to sell. So let's look next. So our next section here, just like the poll suggested, is some best practices about product development. We're going to talk about how you can phase out your product development.
Sorry, did you want to share the presentation again?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you for pointing out. Okay, so we're going to talk about, just from our experience, some of the best practices in developing a new product. First, we're going to talk about phases of developing a product. This is how we try to divide the whole development effort. Then we're going to talk about MVPs, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at the phases, and I'll tell you why we always do phased approach in product development. So usually at FYELABS, we try to define 3 distinct phases in developing a product. One is first, we create what we call a proof of concept, which basically de-risks the product. It takes all the very, very high risk elements and designs experiments to make sure those risks those risks are mitigated. Next, we usually go on to a prototype. A prototype would be something where everything about the product is functioning, but on a lab bench or in a laboratory environment. If it's software, it's on a local machine or a single server. And then we go to an MVP. And this concept of the MVP is actually very important. MVP stands for minimum viable product. We'll get into showing some examples about that in a second. But the purpose of an MVP is mostly to validate the hypothesis that you created about your value propositions and customer segment. Or more importantly, it is something that has the minimum functionality to find paying customers. So look at some examples here. This is what Amazon.com started as. Doesn't look pretty, doesn't look cutting edge in any way, but it helped them validate that people were willing to pay for buying books online. Similar example, Airbnb. Couple guys in an apartment somewhere in San Francisco, I believe, who decided they're going to just rent out their air mattress. And that's where the name Airbnb was born, I guess. And the reason people focus on a minimum viable product to be as bare bones as possible is to make sure that you have capacity, both financial and mental energy, I guess, to pivot. Because the whole concept of customer discovery and product development is to make sure that you find a paying customer. And this is where I like to cite this story of Instagram, where Instagram actually was born as an app called Bourbon. But the founders realized that most of the features in Bourbon were not really being used by the customers. So they created a very bare bones app, and they realized it was only the photo sharing feature that was generating a lot of traction. And that's how they started focusing on that feature. So with this, we have another poll coming up. Like I said, there's no right or wrong answer to any of these polls, but if you have tried developing a product, or if you're thinking of developing a product, what is your strategy going to be? Are you going to do a binary 0, 2, 1? Are you going to be doing iterative with feedback loop, or are you doing something more savvy like the TRL system? Are you ready for the poll?
So the game pin is also at the bottom, but I'll move on to our next question.
poll. So again, a closed competition with between the iterative with feedback loop and the TRL system. Now, would one of you who follow the TRL system perhaps volunteer to talk about, like TRL system is usually great for more technologically advanced products, but would someone volunteer to talk about that a little bit? Or if you change your mind later, let me know, because I don't have any information on the TRL system here in this presentation, but it would be great to cover here as well. Hey, with that, let's go back to our presentation. So the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is this concept for called DFMA, Design for Manufacturing and Assembly, also known as designing for market, because you can't just make one or a prototype. So one of the things I wanted to list here is when you're building a product, especially if it's a hardware product, make sure you are incorporating some of these principles. Google this, you'd learn all of the best practices about DFMA, but the concept is you design it so that it's functional, but more importantly, it's producible and it's built for like handling and fitting, etc. But the most important concept is make sure it's something that you're going to be able to mass produce or like produce to the volumes that you're targeting and not just designed for one prototype. Okay, so this kind of brings us to the end of the product development strategy, like product development best practices section. We have next up, we would go into marketing and sales. So the softer things, well, it's a myth that like marketing and sales are easier than engineering. I would actually say marketing and sales are way harder than engineering in many ways. Because from my personal experience, I've seen like especially if you're starting a new business, you spend way more time, money, and energy into selling and marketing as opposed to building a product. But with that, like, is there any questions from the product development part at all? You can put it into the chat. You can, unmute yourself and say something. I have a surprise prize for the first person who asked the question. Still nothing? Okay. All right, let's move on to, we have another poll coming up, which is, if you have thought about a marketing strategy, what is your marketing strategy? So we have Kamil and raise a hand. So Kamil, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question regarding the previous thing, which is the MVP.
Yeah.
And you kind of showed how Amazon and Airbnb, when they started out, they didn't really look that great and they kind of got better over time.
Yep.
And that kind of makes sense when you're the first ever person to do something. But if you already have competitors in this sphere, isn't there a danger that your MVP, which doesn't look very well, will just turn people away? Like if the market has some level of maturity, won't people just look at your half-baked product and walk away and not even give you a chance?
That's a great question. So MVP is, look, so think about a half-baked. A half-baked is something that is not functional, and the MVP has to be functional, but minimum functional. No, this is all very conceptual, right? And so it's somewhat relative to what it is that you're trying to do. But always when you're starting a business, if you have a product that has a competition already, you're probably sub-segmenting a part of their customer base. So and this does not apply for commodity businesses. Like if you're launching something that has the exact same product out in the market already, it's and in the same geographical market, like if you want to compete with Uber in Canada, you're going to have a very hard time. But if you want to, create a ride-sharing service that has some unique features, like a ride-sharing service that is specifically designed for the elderly, or a ride-sharing service that is designed for pet owners, or something like that, then you're not exactly like, you have competition, but you have a certain thing that is unique about you. And what I've seen people do is create an MVP around that, because like when you have a unique thing like that, you have a hypothesis about your customer segment. Like think about ride sharing for the elderly. You assume that if you have specific features in the vehicles, like easier access, and that it's going to be a minivan always or something like that. That's still a hypothesis. You want to test that out, and you want to test that out, I guess, with like the minimum amount of resources possible. That's where the concept of the MVP is really powerful. But if you want to go head on with Uber and do exactly what Uber does right now, then yes, your product has to be somehow better than Uber. But that's the kind of product development that requires a lot of capital upfront. So startups typically stay away from something like that.
Okay, thanks. I think that clarifies a good point. So I guess it comes down to your value proposition and having a very clear idea about who your customers are. And your minimum functionality better be something they need. Otherwise, you go back to the drawing board.
Yep, and there is a lot of theories about the concept of disruptive innovation by this one gentleman out of MIT, I believe. I can't, for some reason, remember his name right now. But if you look them up, you basically, when you're creating a new product, it's always best to target a customer segment that has a pain that they can't solve with what's out there right now. Cool. With that, let's move on to our next poll about marketing. All of you are probably engineers. I don't think there are any non-engineers on this call. So this is when things get a little more interesting. Next poll about marketing. If you've thought about marketing or marketing strategy, what is it? Nice. We have a perfect balance between outbound and inbound. So next up, Erica will explain the concepts of outbound and inbound. She's a marketing guru. So Erica, do you want to take it away? I'll be your voice activated slide changer.
That's perfect. Thank you. All right. So we'll start with the very basics of marketing. And you can go ahead to the next slide, Suvojit. So yeah, we'll start with the very basics, which is the 4 Ps, and then I'll talk a little bit more about inbound versus outbound marketing, and the importance of establishing your brand, and then I'll look into what we are working on at FYELABS right now. So you can head to the next slide, please. Thank you. Perfect. So the 4 Ps, you may or may not be familiar with this idea. So generally, all of your marketing efforts will revolve around the 4 Ps, which are product or service, price, promotion, and place. These have been expanded upon through other ideas, but generally, these are the 4 main things that your marketing will revolve around. So your channels and your strategy may change, but these will remain constant. So your product or service is essentially what your company sells. So this can include your product variations and product lines, your packaging, how your product is going to be presented, and also how your product is going to be serviced. So if you're offering any like warranties or anything like that, so you want to make sure you're very clear on all of the sub ideas of your product before you come up with your marketing strategy. The next thing is your price. So obviously, how much will it cost? But also things like you need to do things like conducting market research to determine what your cost to produce is versus what people are willing to pay. You need to decide if you're offering any discounts and what that will do to your cost to produce it and how much you're going to profit off of this, as well as if you're offering any payment plans or options. If your product or service is more expensive, can you accommodate people with that are interested in the product but perhaps can't pay the whole amount up front? Yes, the session is being recorded, so we will make it available to you. I just saw that question pop up there. Next is the promotion of your product. So this is where you get into what channels are being used to promote the product. So are you going with a completely digital strategy? Are you using some more traditional print channels? That's something that you have to decide, and I'll go into a little bit more about that in a second. So yeah, again, online, offline, are you going to do events, etc. And then as well, what's the message that you want to convey about your product or your service that you're offering? And how do you want that to come across? So you need to think about the